wise men of old did the guiding star behold, as with joy they hailed its light, leading onward, beaming bright. So most gracious Lord, may we evermore be led by Thee.
As with joyful steps they speed, Savior, to Thy lowly bed, there to bend the knee before Thee, whom heaven and earth adore. So may we with willing feet ever seek Thy mercy seat.
As they offered gifts most rare at Thy cradle rude and bare, so may we with holy joy, pure and free from sin's alloy, all our costless treasures bring Christ to Thee, our heavenly King. Holy Jesus, every day keep us in the narrow way, and when earthly things are past, bring our ransomed souls at last. Where they need no star to guide, where no clouds Thy glory hide. In the heavenly country bright, need they no created light. Thou its light, its joy, its crown, Thou its run which goes not down. Therefore ever may
branch of royal David's stem. In thy birth at Bethlehem, anthems be to thee addressed. God in man made manifest. Manifest at Jordan stream, prophet, priest, and king supreme, and at Cana wedding guest, in thy Godhead manifest. Manifest in power divine, changing water into wine. Anthems be to thee addressed. God in man made manifest. Manifest in making whole palsied limbs and fainting soul. Manifest in valiant fight, quelling all the devil's might. Manifest in gracious will, ever bringing good from hell. Anthems be to thee addressed. God in man made manifest. Sun and moon shall darkened be, stars shall fall, the heavens shall flee. Christ will then like lightning shine, all will see his glorious sign. All will then the trumpet hear, all will see the judge appear. Thou by all wilt be confessed, God in man made manifest. Grant us grace to see thee, Lord, present in thy holy word. Grace to imitate thee now, and be pure as pure art thou, that we might become like thee at thy great epiphany, and may praise thee ever blessed, God in man made manifest. The star proclaims the king is here, but Herod, why this senseless fear? For he who offers heavenly birth seeks not the kingdoms of this earth. The eastern sages saw from far, and followed on his guiding star, and led by light to light they trod, and by their gifts confessed their God.
Good morning to those joining us online. You don't have to rush back. I'm gonna move this camera just a little bit. We had an incident with the coffee. The coffee machine got unplugged and we didn't know it, so there's 4 of us were back there trying to figure out how to make coffee. But we got it figured out, so that's why we're starting just a little bit late. Their guys are over there sitting around waiting to pour their coffee cups, so we're going to be diving in here just a little bit. We are in Genesis, right? I mean, it's the name of the Bible study, and last week we just got to this kind of the start of Noah. So Genesis 1 and 2 are the creation accounts with different focuses. Genesis 4 deals with Cain and Abel. Or Genesis 3 deals with the fall. Genesis 4 deals with kind of the immediate effects, descent into sin, the effects of sin. And chapter 5 is the glue that bonds the next, the previous narrative, so creation, fall, descent into sin, with the next narrative, which is the flood account and Noah. And so we went through tracing the promise through the different generations till we got to Noah at the start of chapter 6. And what we find with Noah in the start of chapter 6 is that there's increasing corruption in the world, and that God has decided that enough is enough and it is time for a judgment event. And as we talked about, judgment, God's judgment is always a two-edged sword. It's salvation for the faithful and it's judgment on the unfaithful. And so we're going to find that Noah and 7 people are saved. And just a quick thing, this isn't the only time Noah is mentioned in the Bible. In fact, we find that people in the Old Testament get referenced quite a bit in the New Testament. Adam obviously gets referenced quite a bit, but Peter, in his second epistle in chapter 2, says this. This is verse 5. If he, that's God, did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the... and so Noah gets mentioned there, and also Noah gets mentioned in the famous passage of baptism, when Peter deals with baptism. But notice what Peter calls Noah, a herald of righteousness. In other words, a preacher. A preacher. And so the patriarchs of the faith, they're not just faithful men, but they also teach the faith, they preach the faith to their children, to their descendants. Now, whether their children follow that or not, when you're an adult, you choose to do what you want. But they taught it to their spouse. Obviously, we see Adam at one point taught Eve, we don't eat of this certain tree, but we eat of all the other trees, because she tells Satan explicitly what God's command was. And so we see this, and so we know that when we find a patriarch, a righteous man in the Old Testament, it's not just somebody who's following the commands of God, but it's also somebody who's teaching and preaching who God is, what God does, or had done to this point, and things like that, to those around them, to their family, that is mainly their kids and their spouses. They have any servants in their household, things like that. So, we got through, I think, verse 8 of last week of chapter 6. I'm just going to read these first 8 verses very briefly to set up the story here. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born of them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the heaven, or was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I'm sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Check, make sure we do have audio. Okay. And we dealt with that and some of the peculiarities and oddities in that passage last week. So had quite a bit of discussion on that. So I don't want to dive into it this week. If you're watching online and you missed that, I encourage you to go back and watch last week's video. The Nephilim were, basically really big sinners. The word translates basically to thug. And so basically there's a lot going on, but the key point of this is that man is consumed by wickedness. Every inclination of our hearts is wickedness. And we see this later on with in sin was I conceived, in sin did my mother bear me. In other words, our first nature, this side of eternity, is sinful. Our sin, original sin, has corrupted our nature. And so we don't want to do good things. We don't want to do the things of God. We want to do what we want to do. We want to do what makes us happy, what brings us pleasure. And those things, we'll find out, if I give into my lust, to my greed, to my covetousness, if I worship only myself or money or something like that, those things go against the commands of God, right? And so without the external preaching of the word, we don't know what is good, right, and salutary. We don't know what is God-pleasing. We don't know what gives eternal life because all we know is sin, right?
I was thinking on this this week, and I thought, because we're talking about the sons of God and the daughters of man, and it struck me that God's not different. In the New Testament, it talks about not to be unequally yoked, and that's really what we're talking about here. Is the sons of God and the daughters of man.
Yeah.
I mean, you have believers in God, and then you have those that start to take God for granted. So it shouldn't surprise us any.
No. You say, how do you take God for granted? That kind of leads me to that question. How do you take God for granted?
Well, it's easy. You just do what you want to do.
Exactly. You just do what you want to do. You assume that you're going to take the next breath that you're going to take no matter what. That you aren't dependent, your very existence isn't dependent on God. And we find that all over the world today. So, let's start with verse 9. Somebody wants to read that.
These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Let me stop there.
Yeah, that's good. I keep on hearing a weird echo, and I don't know if it's because the air conditioning's on or what, but it's throwing me off. So, we get a recap of everything we've just read beforehand, right? In that first verse, in verse 9 and 10, or excuse me, in verse 9. And in verse 10, we get told that Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? And then we get a recap again of what's going on with the world. So any thoughts there? Where'd you stop?
I stopped at 14.
Okay.
Well, 13.
Okay.
I finished. Well, we like to think it's pretty bad today, but and of course God might be sitting in the heavens saying, you know, this is going to end soon, the way this is going. But for God to say He's going to put an end to all flesh, it must have been really bad.
Yeah.
You know.
No, violence. The earth is filled with violence through them.
Yeah.
So it's not just like normal sinfulness, so to speak. Basically, like, the impression is that the world is filled with anarchy, right? The exact opposite of creation. The creation account is
Order, disorder.
chaos to order. And now we just have complete chaos, right? Reminds me of the passages in Judges all the time where each did what was right in his own sight, right? And so, in this sense, what's right for me is raping, robbing, pillaging, right? It's kind of the sense that you get there. And the other thing that strikes me, and this kind of brings back what we read just a little bit before this with the start of Genesis 6. I will blot out man who have created. So this is verse 7. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. That the effects of sin don't just affect us, right? And we're going to see this when he says, I've determined to make an end of all flesh. Our sin doesn't just affect us. And again, punished to the third and fourth generation for the sins of the fathers, blessing to 1,000 generations, or blessing thousands who love me. The implication there is 1,000 generations of those who love me. Just a way that they spoke in the ancient world. So our sin never just affects ourself. It affects those around us and affects the wider world. Roses have thorns, right? Right now, my cucumbers in my garden are being overtaken by fungus. I'm like, oh great, do I want to deal with that or just let them go for the year and amend the soil and try again next year? First of all, original sin has affected the whole world, and then our actual sin affects the whole world. It causes pain. It causes other people to sin. Right? Think of David and Bathsheba. David caused somebody else to murder for him because of his lust for Bathsheba. And so when people try to excuse away sin, it's a very myopic view of just, well, it's only really affected me. And the flip side of this attitude, by the way, is the quote-unquote personal relationship with God of, it's just between me and God, right? Nothing's just between you and God. So your sin doesn't just affect you. It affects all those around you, and this is that writ large. So he's going to destroy everything. He's going to destroy the earth, the plants. And so before he does that, he gives this command. Let's pick up verse 14. Somebody wants to read through there. 14 through 16.
So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 foot high. make a roof for it, and finish the ark to within 18 inches of the top. Put a door in the side of the ark, and make lower, middle, and upper decks.
All right. So, he's going to do that, though. He tells Moses to do something. Moses tells Noah to do something. What's he tell Noah to do?
Build a boat.
Yeah, build a boat. The Hebrew word that's used, that we translate for ark here, is not normally the word used for Ark of the Covenant. That word translates to box. The Hebrew word here is only also used in Exodus 2, 3, and 5. Yeah, which is the basket that Moses was placed in. So it is some sort of vessel made for floating in water, right? We see that Exodus, see that here. Large. This one's, of course, large. Moses was obviously not anywhere near this large. And he tells them, you know, how big to make it. So any questions on that? There's nothing really crazy here. I don't know if you've been to like the Ark Encounter in Tennessee, wherever. It's a very large boat. We're not 100% sure how long a cubit actually is. We have a very rough guesstimate.
Isn't it this?
Yes, but the thing about it is that also varies, right?
Yeah.
The one that also varies. Two, that's a much later definition of what a cubit is than what Noah would have had necessarily, right? Like it's a measurement kind of Roman. So we're fairly certain it's in that range. Could have been a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger, obviously. This Moses putting in a unit of measurement here so that the Israelites would understand it, that, you know, lived a few thousand years after this. Quite possible. Doesn't matter. The point is, some people have argued about this, about how big the boat should be.
I think it was big enough.
To me, it goes in the bins of who cares.
Yeah.
The big boat.
Yeah, it's a big boat. It needs to be a big boat. It's a big boat. So here's where things start to get interesting. Okay? He's not said how he's going to blot everything out yet. In verse 17, somebody just wants to read through the end of the chapter.
Behold, even I am bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives, and you, with you. And everything of all flesh you shall bring two of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds after their kind, of the animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind. Two of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. As for you, take yourself some of all food which is edible and gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. Thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him. So he did.
All right. So there's a lot of things there in those few verses. God has announced how he's going to bring his judgment. And how's he going to do it?
The flood.
The flood. Now, I'm just going to read this note here at the bottom of my study guide because this sums it up a lot, in a lot less words than I would take to read this, or to say when this flood story in the ancient Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered in the 1800s. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest work of literature that we know, all right, and deals with this guy named Gilgamesh, this Sumerian hero, basically, or proto-Sumerian hero, right? And there's a flood account in there. Okay, so it was discovered in the 1800s. Some scholars regarded this as proof that the Israelites had simply copied or adapted Mesopotamian legends for writing the story of Noah. However, subsequent research has demonstrated the universality of the flood story, which is told in various forms by numerous cultures across several continents. All right? So, you guys probably aren't on the TikToks, right? That's the app with the little videos that used to be owned by China and now it's owned by a US company. There's a guy that's, I mean, he's got a lot of followers, thousands of followers, and he always like, oh, you know, you follow the God of Noah, then you follow, and he names some sort of Sumerian god or whatever. Again, because he's like, well, I've done research, and he holds up a book, okay? I just want to make a TikTok and be like, I've done research, I have a library, not just a book.
May as well do it on YouTube.
Yeah, it's just, and so anyway, what's really interesting, and Pastor Dave can probably speak to this too, having gone through seminary, because we have to deal and interact with some of these things, and I say it's interesting, it's disheartening, because it just shows people are more for confirmation bias than critical thinking. The amount of things that come out in the 17 and 1800s, the real Jesus movement, Epic Gilgamesh, things like that, things that have been disproven by 99% of academia, all right, liberal or conservative, and how popular they are with people that have just read a book and they said, aha, see, this is where Christianity falls down, right? Jesus wasn't really real. He was completely made up. The flood story is based off the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is 200 to sometimes 300 years of research after that they completely skip over to get to those conclusions. And yet they are so popular. And with the advent of social media, everybody's, the decline of expertise, everybody's their own expert, right? 10 minutes of research on Facebook makes me just as smart as somebody who spent a lifetime in this field of study or doing this job, right? Has just proliferated this, quite frankly, and excuse my language, this crap everywhere. And I mean, it's just so crazy. The disheartening thing for me is when there are people that go to like a liberal theology school and then they post this stuff out there and it's just like, I don't know what school you went to, but you need to get your money back. Because again, this stuff has been discredited. When it comes to literature sources of Julius Caesar, the first one we have is 300 years after his life. The earliest copy that we have of that is 800 years after his life. Nobody doubts that Julius Caesar lived, right? And when I say like earliest copies, we're talking a handful, right? So like when people are like, well, Jesus didn't really exist. The Gospels, Paul's writings, Paul's first letters are within 30 years of Jesus' death. The Gospels, and if you credit Mark to be the first, is within 40 years of Jesus' death, right? The canon is closed. I shouldn't say closed, but what we have of the New Testament is done by 100 AD. 70 years after the death of Jesus, right? We have fragments dating to 90 AD, right? So you have to be either completely unknowing, which is what a lot of people are, to sit there and say some of these things. And again, it just proves that people are looking for confirmation bias. We had to deal with these things. We had the real Jesus movement, things like that. And sit there and say, not just go find some confirmation bias against this, but these are their arguments, right? Is there any evidence or that prove or disprove this, right? And like how to look at, I'm not going to say source material, right? As being just Masters of Divinity students, it's not like we could walk in and see the fragment from 1 Corinthians from 90 AD that's housed in Stuttgart or someplace.
We could see it at a distance.
Yeah, but we had to read both the academic literature that was for it at the time, and then read published research papers over as more evidence came to light. The biggest thing that pushed back the dating on the liberal dating of the Bible, by the way, is the Qumran documents found in 1949, 47 or 49, something like that. And then there was another one in the 60s, like 63, something like that. And they pushed back Isaiah almost 1,000 years because of that. Right? So to sit there and say, well, this argument from the 1800s, we just have to ignore everything, is too, there's been great archaeological evidence since then, is the whole point. So the fact that there is a flood narrative, a cross-continents, and I talked about this last time, cross-continents, is pretty good proof that the Israelites did not just copy or adapt the Epic of Gilgamesh. Unless somehow the Chinese did it as well. Right? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, that whole side tangent there on that. So that's just the flood, dealing with the flood.
Geological evidence too.
Yeah, there is. So.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like you said, we studied both sides of these arguments, but there is a percentage of people in the world that are determined that I'm not going to believe in God or a creator or Jesus or anything. And a good example is Watson and Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for describing the genome of DNA. And and I can't remember if it's Watson or if it's Crick, I think it's Crick, that after 10 years after he's discovered this in the 60s in Time magazine, and I still have a copy of it, he's interviewed and he says, I now know from genetics that evolution is not possible. That he said, since I have decided that I choose not to believe in a creator God, I believe 2 aliens from another world dropped 2 sacks on this earth, and we all came from those 2 sacks. Now, as silly as that sounds, at least he's saying, okay, we all came from Adam and Eve to start with, but he was so against God, and it's that percentage of the population that promotes all these different
Yeah.
weird and crazy
I have
ideas.
another example. know if you guys hear it, but every time you talk, there's a slight echo. I don't know why. I don't know if it's filters, whatever.
We drank the weak coffee, so that's
Yeah. No. You guys ever hear the House of Daoud? You ever hear of him? House of Daoud? So he's an archaeologist in the ancient world. Syria or Babylon, I can't remember which one. They're working on a dig, and they find this monument to the king's conquests, and listing off all these places that they conquer, right? And they come across the House of Daoud. Only it's David. But it can't be David. They don't believe David exists. This is a school in Denmark. These guys are in Denmark.
That drives them crazy.
See, it has to be Daoud because David was just a mythological figure in the Israelite conscience that gave them kind of this divine mandate kingdom. And so when they're asked, well, who's the House of Daoud? Well, we don't know. This is the first we've ever heard of it. So there's always a certain population that is just always looking for something else to explain these things, reason, excuses. So that's the flood, right? So there is a flood account. It's a there's a universal flood account across continents, across cultures. Verse 18. This is God's dropping another big bomb here. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Okay, a covenant, you guys probably all heard this. A covenant is basically like a contract. And to enter into a contract takes two parties, right? One party agrees to do something, and the other party agrees to do something, right? For example, you guys do this all the time. You go shopping at Walmart, and you sit there and say, I'm going to buy these groceries and hand you $50. And Walmart says, we will take that $50, and you will walk away with those groceries, right? You hire somebody to renovate your bathroom, right? You sign a contract, schedule, materials, cost, right? So a covenant can be complicated. It can be a simple barter transaction, right? But here's where it's different. What's Noah doing?
so long for the ride.
Yeah. Nothing. I will establish my covenant with you. It's not a two-party interact. I mean, it's two parties, but only one is doing the work. Only one's agreeing to do something. The other is getting all the benefits. To make an analogy of this, it'd be like your neighbor coming up and saying, I'm going to take care of your yard. Here's the services that I hired. You don't have to do anything.
That would be nice.
Right? Only this is dealing with you, your wife, your sons' wives will be saved. That's my covenant. My covenant is saving people. Right? And this is the first time that the word covenant has been used in the Bible, by the way. It wasn't used with Adam and Eve. It wasn't used with any of the descendants from not till Noah. I will establish my covenant with you. And when he establishes the covenant with Noah, how does Noah react? You will come into the ark. I will put my salvation upon you, and you will come into my salvation. Right? Because that's what the ark is. It's a saving device. It's salvation. Not just you, but your family as well. And then, famously, 2 of every animal. Now, if I asked you to take a test and say, how many animals of every kind did God say to take on the ark, what would you say?
As many as he wanted.
Well, how many did God tell? How many did Noah take on the ark of every animal?
Two.
At least two.
At least no, but seven. Seven. Wasn't there seven?
Yeah, he gives it again. I failed this question on the prerequisite exam. He's going to come back. We're going to read this in a little bit. God's going to come back and say 2 of every unclean animal, 7 of every clean animal. This is why 2 ravens are allowed to go out, and there's still ravens in the world.
And what about the unicorn? I mean, the unicorn is mentioned in here. But I won't, never mind.
I think they were late. I don't know. And then, what's the food? What is Noah? What's everybody eat? What's everybody supposed to be eating at this time?
Vegetables.
Vegetables, right? Fruits and veggies. Everybody's a vegetarian at this point in history, or at least they're supposed to be a vegetarian at this point in history. Every sort of food that is eaten and stored up, it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this, and he did all that God commanded him. This is one of the few things that the movie Noah got right. Right? That Noah was a vegetarian. All right? Now, whereas the bad guys ate meat, and you know that's going into some Gnosticism playing off there, but Noah was a vegetarian. So let's dive into chapter 7. Just read 1 through 5.
The Lord then said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 of every clean animal, and its male and its mate, and 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate. Also 7 of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made." And Noah did all the Lord commanded.
And actually, I just misspoke with that whole thing, by the way, earlier. I don't know, yours didn't say this, but mine, the ESV translates it 7 pairs of every clean animal, so 14 of every clean animal, and 1 pair of every unclean animal.
I think we need a bigger boat.
Yeah.
That is a big boat.
Yeah. So Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. So twice this ends with, okay, verse 22, the end of chapter 6. Noah did this, and he did all that God commanded him. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. So Noah builds the boat, gathers the food, right? Just done everything God's commanded him. God, okay, get in the boat. This many animals. Noah does everything that he commanded him. Now, there's some logistics questions, obviously, right? How can there be that much space? But one of the big ones is how is there that much food? Right?
The Amazon truck just backed up to the door and unloaded.
I think of it more as the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, the Elijah and the widow.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and the Israelites wandering in the wilderness.
You know, when you look at the account of Noah feeding all the animals and his family for years, basically, until the floodwaters receded anyhow, there was absolutely no room on that boat to store enough food to feed everybody, all the animals in his family for that length of time. So it had to be, he stored different types of food for each of the animals, and the Lord made that food last until the end of the flood.
Yes, which is what I was pointing out with the different accounts, right? And you sit there and say, well, the Israelites, you know, they had to gather their manna every day and double the amount on Saturdays. But we're told that their clothes, their sandals don't wear out during that time, right? They're 40 years in the desert, and they don't have a sandal strap that ever breaks, right? World's best made sandals, or God providing, right? Elijah and the widow, the flour and oil never run out until you know, the famine's over. The feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. You know, just a few loaves of bread, a few fish, feeds people. There's a ton left over, right? As Vic pointed out, and that's what honestly I think, because he's just told to grab. Every sort of food that is eaten and stored up. Not this much food for these many days, but take every type and store it up.
Yeah. I don't know if you skip ahead to the end of the chapter, it said the waters flooded the earth for 150 days.
Yeah.
I mean, that would equate out to a bunch of food.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking literal tons of food.
I think it's more interesting the years that it took him to build the ark.
Oh yeah.
Because we hear 500 years when the three boys were born, and then the next thing you hear, he's going on to the ark, and it's 600 years.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you give them 30 years, you're talking about 70 years. I think in Hebrews it talks about the number of years. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Used to, I knew that.
And the Lord, you know, the Lord provides. He builds a boat, and if Noah wasn't a shipbuilder and carpenter before then, he was by the end.
That's true.
Okay. So they get up in the boat. I'll read verses 6 through 10 here. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of the waters came upon the earth, and Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. Right? So always dramatically, the last, squirrel is running in and the rain starts to fall. There's 7 days. They're in the boat 7 days before it starts to flood. Right? I guess Vic had to leave. But, so the flood comes up. They're in there. Notice this, all right, 2 and 2, male and female, right? Because they were supposed to bring pairs. 7 pairs of clean, 2 pairs of every unclean, right? So they came in by their pairs, not, oh, there's only 2 of every clean, 2 of every unclean again. All right, so Noah is 600 years old. He's done the divine instruction.
So he's been working on this thing his whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 100 years.
Yeah.
He's been working on it 100 years.
Where do we get 100 years? Because I answered a question yesterday. It was on one of those Facebook things, and I did an internet search. How long did it take? And I had different answers, and there was different answers, everything from 120 years to 600 years that he worked on the ark.
Well, it talks earlier about when his sons were born, he was 500 years old.
So
That's
the-
before I mentioned
so
of the
that-
flood.
okay,
That's
would be the-
that's
so-
532
Okay.
is when he has his son. He's 500 years old. Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
So 500 to 600, we know it was less than 100 years, because
Those boys, well, again, we don't know exactly when
Yeah.
the boys were born, but at 500 years old, maybe Japheth was born when Noah was 500 years old. All right. By the time that God comes to Noah in so that's 532. By 6:9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah is a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's when God comes to him, right? At some point, God comes to him and tells him to build an ark. I'm going to bring floodwaters on, and who's going to go into the ark with you? Your wife, your sons' wives. And he's 600 years old when the floodwaters come up. So that's why it's assumed somewhere between 100 or 70 years, depending, of the.
because the boys had to be married. They don't automatically get married when they're born.
Yeah. I don't know if you necessarily marry your daughter off to a father-in-law who's crazy and building a big boat. Doing
Yeah,
nothing
I
else.
think it needed 30 years in there to be normal.
Yeah. All right. Somebody want to start with 11 and just 11 through 16.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the day all the fountains of the deep, great deep, burst forth, and the wind of the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature, they went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. In other words, the Lord shut the door.
Now, so Noah goes in, floods there. Noah's obviously righteous. It's been told many times. God's going to establish his covenant with Noah. We get a echo of this with Abraham, by the way. Very similar things happen in this sense. God shows up to Abraham. I'm going to establish my covenant with you. Right? The sign of the Abrahamic covenant is circumcision. But I'm going to establish my covenant with you.
Well, it even goes back to, it reminds you of creation with the listing of the livestock and the creeping things that creep on the earth and the birds. The fish aren't mentioned, but the fish are going to make it through this fine.
Yeah. But what I mean here is that the sign of the covenant is that you're gonna have descendants, right? And Abraham believes God, and as Roman tells us, it was and as Genesis tells us, Roman quotes it, Paul quotes it, right? It was credited to him or counted to him as righteousness. Noah, he's walking with God. God tells him, build this ark, the flood's going to come. Noah has an option. Right? Just like Adam and Eve had the option. Do I believe God? Or do I believe tomorrow's going to be a sunny day? Right? Noah believes God. He builds the ark. And he's saved. He's saved not because of the work of building the ark. He's saved because he believed God. And so he did what God commanded him. God could have saved Noah 1,000 different ways. And his family 1,000 different ways. He chose this way. Abraham could have laughed in God's face. I'll see it when I believe it, right? But what he believes. And this is the pattern that we see. We are saved today because we believe that Christ saves us. And when we believe that, his salvation is given to us. Right? Faith works that which it accomplishes, or that which is its goal. Faith works that which is its goal. In other words, it accomplishes what it says it does. Right? This is the pattern that we find throughout the scriptures. We are not saved by works. We are saved by believing the Word of God. Now, that believing of Word of God leads to works. This is James' whole point. This is Luther's point, right? When people are like, oh, you're getting rid of good works. And Luther's point is like, I'm not getting rid of good works. But if you have faith, as James says, if you have faith, your faith should be active. People should see the fruits of your faith. Think of your faith as a vine, right? As a tomato plant, right? What's the sign of a healthy tomato plant?
Tomatoes.
Tomatoes, right? If your faith is the tomato plant, the tomatoes are your good works. If you're not putting out good tomato plants, or if you're not putting out any tomato plants, what are you? You're a weed. You're taking away water and nutrition from the good plants around you. And you know what the gardener does to the weed? Pulls it out. Back then, they would burn it. All right. I throw it in my compost pile.
Interesting that you bring about using an example of tomatoes. 4 tomato plants. 2 tomatoes so far. To the point of writing off the tomatoes. Walked out there this morning and there's 6 new ones on there.
My wife says it's the bees.
Yeah.
Oh, the pollination.
I'm not having a lot of tomatoes. I got 4 tomato plants and the plants are huge. And I don't mean to change the topic here, but
Yeah.
for the same thing, I mean, they're beautiful plants,
Yeah.
but I only got a handful of tomatoes on
I
them,
got-
maybe 10, 15 tomatoes.
I got 2 pea plants that are less than 3 inches tall.
When'd you
My
plant
peas are
them?
doing good.
I use these big round containers
No, when did you plant the peas?
early on. I mean,
Oh.
just like I said, soak them in water, plant them.
So just backing up here to a little bit of gardening stuff. I love to garden. I don't think we're going to try squash anymore. I'm so tired of trying to fight the squash bugs and
Ask
find
Ron
Yeah.
Troutwine how to do squash. He's got squash coming out of his ears.
Oh, I do too. If I can keep my plants alive. Like I said, I don't have the time to go out there multiple times a day to get the bugs off. And again, my cucumbers have. I don't say again. My cucumbers right now they have a fungus, and I don't want to
See,
deal
my
with it.
cucumbers are going good.
Yeah,
I'm growing them up.
But all right, my tomatoes are going crazy. One of the things though that I understand is one, we've had a really cool year, right? And 2, we've got so much rain. It's playing havoc with all the plants. Because peas are usually early spring, late summer. Like you plant them again in late summer, and you get your fall peas. This has been a really weird year for all of that. Yeah, my tomatoes are going crazy. My pepper plants finally took off. I planted some heatless jalapenos,
Yeah, I got some of those too.
and they just flowered yesterday.
Oh, so it's
No,
not
mine have been
I
flowering
thought it was
early.
just my plant.
No, they just flowered yesterday.
Okay.
I put in onions and sweet potatoes in one bed, and that cold snap that we had messed the onions up, and so they started to flower. Because onions are in a 2-year cycle. They flower the second year, so a lot of times the onions that you're buying from the garden are the second-year onions, right? Because they grow big, they'll go dormant, and then they'll grow. And then what you buy from, Lowe's, those are also usually second-year onions as well, you started or whatever. So they started to flower, and when they start to flower, they stop building bulbs. And so I got a whole bunch of onions that are that big, but my sweet potato plants are going crazy. And we planted a new type of watermelon this year that's doing all right, but it took a while before it took off. Like, it took a while. And watermelon needs dry and hot. It's a desert plant. So all this cool rain has just been playing havoc on everything. I mean, tomatoes are basically, they like hot weather. So anyway, my whole point with that has nothing to do with Bible study. Is keep at it. It's been a weird year. Been a weird year. And then always plant flowers around them.
Yeah, for the bees.
So what I do, I always have 2 or 3 different types of flowers in the beds as well. I try to get ones that will repel the bad insects. So like
Lavender.
I don't have lavender because that's a perennial, that's a bush, and I'll keep on coming back. But I have like marigolds in the squash beds, and they're supposed to repel squash bugs, and they kind of do that. They made it a lot easier this year, I should say that. But you attract more bugs with them. But.
Well, you were talking about bearing fruit. I was thinking, but our faith also leads us to obey, and that's also what Noah and Abraham.
Yeah, well, and
Yeah,
so what is a good work,
Fruit,
right?
being
Right.
obedient.
What's our definition of a good work? Our definition of good work isn't civil righteousness. Our definition of good work is doing the things commanded by God. But now it's no more from the threat of the law. It's because I'm responding to the love that God has shown me, and I'm responding in faith to that, right? That's a good work. And so following the first commandment, the second commandment, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, doing those commandments are good works. They don't lead to salvation, right? Because if I was to sit there and say, well, I follow this commandment here, you have to count all the times that you didn't follow the commandment, right? But in response to the salvation of Christ, I do the good works that have been laid out for me to do. That is the 10 Commandments, because I want to please God. I want to make God happy. And so you can say that you are obeying God, right? But when your dog doesn't pee in the house, are you really saying your dog is obeying you? Well, no, it just learned that you pee outside, right? And so it's that's really my issue with kind of the ordinances churches, that we follow these ordinances of God, right? The baptism is an ordinance, it's a command, it's something you do. Sacrament of the altar is an ordinance. I mean, are you obeying your wife when you do the dishes? If she asks you to do the dishes? In one sense, yes. But you're doing the dishes because you love your wife and you want to make your wife happy. That's your first motivation. Not, if I don't do this, she's going to yell at me. If you're at that point, go seek some marital counseling, right? And there's no shame in ever seeking counseling of any kind. But you do the dishes because it makes your wife happy, right? And one day you wake up and you just do the dishes before she even asks, right? Why? Because it makes your wife happy. Are you obeying your wife? In a sense, yes. But you're not doing it to win brownie points with her. You're doing it to show that you love her. Right? Anyway, I forgot how we got there.
Tomato plants.
Tomato plants.
You started it.
Tomato plants. That's how we got there. Tomato plants. All right. Did we read? We read 11 through 16. Let's finish this chapter and we'll start. We will not meet next week, by the way. I'll be out of town. So we will not meet next week. If you could announce that on Sunday.
Okay.
So 17 through 24, I'll read these. The flood continued 40 days on the earth.
the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Now, is that 150 days in addition to the 40 days, or does it contain the 40 days? And the answer is yes. You can interpret it easily both ways. But the flood comes up, wipes everything off. And when we... Second Peter 3:6. So flip to the back. You're going to have Hebrews, you're going to have James, and you're going to have 1 Peter. So after 1 Peter is 2 Peter.
Is it 2:3:6?
2:3:6. Okay. So in 2 Peter in 2:5, he's pointed out to Noah, right? Noah was a herald of righteousness. Now in 3:6, so the same letter, just a little bit later, he's going to bring up Noah once again. And this is what the apostle says. And that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. Okay? So we see, again, the account of the flood. So the God forms the water, forms the earth out of the water, right? Forms the dry land, he brings it up out of the water, he puts the water in its places. We saw that with creation. And then he drowns everything on the dry land by water. And that is all being kept up, all that stuff is being kept up for the day of judgment. Oh my goodness. This was not the passage I was thinking of, and I apologize for that. But it all ties in.
You think of 1 Peter 3:20?
Yes.
Because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water.
Yeah. But in verse 21.
Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you.
Corresponds to what?
Corresponds to the saving of the flood.
Yeah. God, we see this pattern in creation, and sometimes we are accused of reading baptism into everything as Lutherans. The dry land comes up out of the water, and God sets the limits. God brings punishment on the earth with the flood. It covers the water. The waters recede. What's there? Dry land again. A clean slate. Right? So even though it still has the effects of the curse on it, the sin things, people, have been wiped clean. In 2 Peter,
the flood coming, the deluge, right? It wipes away all the
wipes away the sinners. 1 Peter, right? But it doesn't kill Noah, right? Noah, 7 people, his wife, his sons' wives. They're in the ark. They're being saved. Baptism, which corresponds to this act of both judgment and salvation, now saves you. Do you see the connection there? Because what happens in baptism? You're put to death. You are buried with Christ. Right? As Paul tells us, you're buried with Christ. The old Adam has been put to death. It has been judged and faces the penalty of judgment. Faces the penalty of its sin. The wages of sin is death, right? And in its place is the new creation. Right? What is foreshadowed in here in Genesis chapter 6.
Excuse me, chapter 7. No. Chapter 6. 7. I forgot where we're at.
We're in 7.
Yeah, chapter 7.
What's foreshadowed here in chapter 7 has come to pass to you, and is yet still but a foretaste, a foreshadowing of your perfect righteous self that will be at the resurrection. This is why we scream, even though we're accused of seeing baptism everywhere, that baptism is everywhere. Because it is. It's everywhere. This isn't something that we just made up. This isn't just something that the church made up. We see there's this thing known as types in the Bible, right? Moses is a type. All the prophets are a type, right? And what does that mean? That means that they're to borrow a phrase from Paul, we see through the looking glass dimly. They are a reflection of what is to come. Moses is a reflection of the perfect Christ. Moses isn't perfect, right? But he reflects the Christ that is to come. He is the major prophet. He leads the people out of their bondage of slavery. Jesus leads us out of the bondage of slavery to sin, right? And he explicitly mentions this. The Son has set you free. You are free indeed. We've never been slaves. He who sins is a slave to sin, right? So there's these types that they're basically, it's a fancy word for foreshadowing. They foreshadow things that are going to happen, or things that happen in the New Testament. And here we have it again with the flood. It foreshadows baptism and what baptism does. So you are saved by faith, right? And this is not a work that you do, which is why we sit there and say, well, if Peter says baptism, which corresponds to this judgment of sin and the salvation of people, the baptism corresponds to that, and baptism now saves you. Baptism must be a work of God, not of man. And if faith saves, as Paul says, and Peter says baptism now saves you, you must receive faith at baptism. And if you can't have faith, in other words, you can't say Jesus is Lord without the Holy Spirit, baptism gives the Holy Spirit. Right? Paul also calls it the washing without hands, washing of regeneration. The Holy Spirit is the pledge, right? The deposit, the guarantee, right? And again, we see this foreshadowed all the way back. First, Genesis chapter 1, then in Genesis chapter 7. Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. God plays by his own rules. There's nothing new under the sun. Okay? This act of water, whether you're dumped, poured, sprinkled, this act of water being poured out, combined with God's word, okay? What was the word to Noah? Build the ark. A flood is coming. Noah builds it, but I will save you if you're on the ark. Okay? I'm paraphrasing God here. There's water, there's God's word. What happens? Noah and his family are saved. Again, we see it here. It's the same formula with baptism. Baptism, there's water, there's God's word. It works salvation. Now, can you reject that salvation? Yes, Noah could have rejected the salvation. We're going to see the sons later. 2 out of the 3, well, especially 1 out of the 3, right? Noah is going to get blitzed off his butt, right? Pass out. So yeah, people can reject that promise. But the promise is given at the preaching of the word. And part of that preaching is baptism. Baptism is a function of the preaching of the word. Right? So, any questions on any of this? We went over 15 minutes. All right. We will pick up with chapter 8 2 weeks from today. So I'll be in Colorado. That's why we're not meeting next week. So thank you for joining us.